Welcome to our session. My name's Reese Hammond and I'll be your presenter for today's webinar. We'll get started really shortly. We'll just wait another minute or so before we get started for a couple more attendees to jump on in, and then we'll get started. Cheers. Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar on ransomware recovery in 2022. My name is Reese Hammond and I am a Channel Services SE covering ANZ, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. So just some basic housekeeping. This session will be recorded and it will be made available to you via email after the session has finished. At the end of the session, there also will be a survey. So it would be great for everyone to fill those out, as we really get a lot of good feedback from them and they help us improve for our next webinars. So if you have any questions at all during this webinar session, please feel free also to enter them into the question box and we'll try and answer them as soon as possible for you. So welcome to our webinar. Some of the topics that we'll be covering today include how you can prepare against a ransomware attack, why immutability and air gapping is key to data security, some best practices around rapid, reliable recovery, and findings from the 2022 Ransomware Trends Report. Now, before we go into too much more detail, it is worth mentioning that any numbers or statistics that I'm going to be referencing today, they come from this report called the Ransomware Trends Report. Now, this Ransomware Trends Report was commissioned by Veeam back in January of this year, where an independent research firm surveyed over 1,000 IT leaders about the impact that ransomware had on their environment. So some of the respondents, they came from organizations of all different sizes all around the world, including, importantly, Australia and New Zealand. And only those that were surveyed, they had to have at least one cyber attack in 2021 to be included in that report and to be surveyed by that independent research firm. So if you want to know a little bit more about the numbers and statistics that are behind ransomware, this report is an excellent resource and it is available for anyone to download for free at the URL link that is provided at the bottom of the slide. And again, I'll be showing it at the very end of this presentation as well. So let's get started, shall we? So let's start off by looking at what goes into planning for your typical disaster, such as fire, flood, or storm. Typically, we can boil these down to 3 or so points of planning. First of all, we need to make sure that we have reliable copies of our data to recover from. Now, this could be copying backups offsite or replicating VMs to another location, but we also need to test those regularly. Secondly, we need to reduce the amount of time required to recover that data and to get those services back up and running ASAP. This is typically accomplished by using orchestration tools and documenting the failover process, so we know what to do during that DR when it strikes, during that disaster. Thirdly is making sure that we have somewhere to recover to, because having a dedicated DR site, or maybe it's picking up the phone and procuring new hardware, hopefully the lead times aren't too long, or maybe the plan is just to recover to the cloud. They're the 3 typical sort of planning things that we go through with your typical disasters like fire or flood. It's like disaster recovery 101. And it's something that I think we're all pretty familiar with, and we've been doing it for a long time. However, with the challenge that ransomware is now creating for organizations these days, that these 3 points of planning, they're no longer good enough and they're no longer adequate enough, and we need to do more. So for starters, it's not for ransomware, it's not always clear how many systems may or may not be affected during that ransomware attack. So during your typical fire or flood disaster, it's usually pretty obvious which systems are impacted. Those systems that are burnt to a crisp or submerged in water, it's pretty obvious to say, well, we're probably going to have to recover the data and the services that they were doing. But with a malware infection, it can be quite difficult to understand or determine which system is affected and which systems are clean and good to go. Secondly, we can't always just restore from backups during a ransomware attack because the backups themselves are targeted during these types of attacks. Backups can often be encrypted, or even worse, simply deleted during a ransomware attack. Thirdly, chances are that those backups may actually contain hibernating malware to begin with. So by restoring from backups, we might actually just be reintroducing that malware back into a clean environment. So looking back at that 1,000 IT leaders that were surveyed in the Ransomware Trends Report, a whopping 52% of organizations simply paid the ransom to recover their data during a ransomware attack, which is a bit worrying because that means that ransom that they had more confidence in paying the ransom to get their data back instead of simply restoring from their backups. And these ransomware attackers, their main priority is to ensure that they get paid as quickly as possible. They aren't checking things like are the decryption keys up to date and working. They're not fixing bugs in the decryption process or algorithm. Instead, what they're doing is they're investing time, money, and energy and resources into developing better tools and better ransomware variants to evade malware scanners and to gain access into new systems so they can get paid more money. So even if you do pay the ransom and you do receive the decryption keys, it's still possible that due to a bug or a multitude of other reasons that decryption process still fails, which leads us to those 24% who did pay the ransom, but they still could not recover the data. So paying the ransom not only can be a very large sum of money, but it's still a complete gamble. So here at Veeam, we want to try and flip those numbers around so everyone has confidence in restoring from backups during a ransomware attack. So you don't have to take that gamble with paying a ransom. Remember, ransomware best practices are always to restore from backups and not to pay the ransom. So what do we do in the face of these ever-evolving ransomware attacks? Well, as Rick Vanover would say, we look to the double cheeseburger. Now, FYI, the double cheeseburger, it's not a Veeam marketing approved name, but I think the name fits quite well regardless. So on the left, we have the backup cheeseburger, and on the right, we have the recovery cheeseburger. And now these double cheeseburgers are how we achieve secure backups, which are indeed your last line of defense against ransomware and will help ensure that you can recover after a ransomware attack. So let's delve a little bit more into these ingredients, with the first one being trusted immutability. Now, trusted immutability is crucial for recovering after a ransomware attack, simply because making the backup data temporarily immutable, we're protecting ourselves against backups from simply being deleted or encrypted, which is a common occurrence during a ransomware attack or really any malicious activity for that matter. So onto the next slide, I've actually got a couple of examples on how we can achieve immutability within Veeam. So on this slide, on the left-hand side, we have our local storage providing the role of a performance tier extent. Now, this is the first place typically where our backups would land. You see you have your DAS options, you have your NAS options, you've even got deduplication appliances that we could target for landing our backups. But we also have this thing called a Veeam hardened repository. Now, the Veeam hardened repository is an excellent choice for ensuring that your primary backups are immutable as soon as they're created. Now, the hardened repository is typically a standalone physical server running a Linux distribution of your choice. It could be CentOS, it could be Red Hat Enterprise Linux, it could be Ubuntu, but it's your choice. Once backups are saved onto that hardened repository, they can't be deleted until the backups have passed the immutability period which you've defined. Now, you could pick 7 days or 21 days or really any time that meets your requirements, but those backups won't be deleted until they've aged past that immutability period. Next, we can also achieve immutability with our capacity tier with things like Amazon S3 or S3 compatible object storage. Backups that are copied here or moved here from the performance tier are made immutable using a technology called object lock, which is provided by the storage provider. And that helps ensure that these restore points are also immutable for the period that you wish to set. Now, for long-term retention, we can even move monthly and yearly GFS restore points into a deeper, cheaper, cooler tier of storage, such as Amazon S3 Glacier. And we can even set immutability on those long-term restore points as well. If we combine the hardened repository on premises with the S3 in the cloud, we can enable immutability at both layers, and we get something called double play immutability. Now, when we have double play immutability and we have immutability across multiple copies of our backups in different regions even, all this greatly increases the chances of having restorable and recoverable backups even after a ransomware attack occurs. So I just wanted to quickly mention that there are many, many more different ways to protect your data from ransomware attacks with Veeam. Now, we've already looked at the Veeam hardened repository and object storage with immutability, but there are other methods available. So we can, for example, we can look to tape and even writing to worm tape media, which stands for write once, read many. We can even leverage our vast array of Veeam cloud service providers with Veeam Cloud Connect Backup with insider protection, which basically means we can copy your backup to a service provider and then make it immutable in the sense that even if you try to delete it, it moves to a hidden secret recycle bin, which you don't have control of. Only the service provider can see that. So after ransomware strikes, we can recover your backups out of that recycle bin. Worth mentioning is that HP Store Once immutability and widely requested Azure Blob immutability is coming in the next version of Veeam Backup and Replication in version 12. And now, everything I've mentioned so far is what I would consider Veeam administered immutability, meaning that Veeam is setting and controlling that immutability flag, but we can also achieve immutability outside of Veeam's control. For example, we can look at things like pure storage safe mode snapshots or even a data domain retention lock are just a few examples. And you can even argue that these provide their own unique layer of protection since it's completely outside Veeam's sphere of influence. So we've covered trusted immutability, part of the equation, and now let's look at the backup verification part, the middle on the left, because the worst time to realize your backups have failed is during a crisis. So it's not enough simply to look at the backup logs, which may be showing successful backup jobs are being completed. We need to actually regularly test and verify what we're backing up, what we're sending to those backup files is actually good, consistent, valid data that we can then restore from. So we can achieve backup verification not by creating manual, complicated scripts, but by leveraging Veeam data labs, because who wants to regularly have to update and test a script? It's too hard in my opinion. We can actually let Veeam do the heavy lifting. So Veeam Data Labs is designed to validate backup recoverability and integrity automatically and easily. So with Veeam Data Labs, we can take backup files or even replicas and run a copy of that instance in an isolated separate network away from production to perform any task that you want away from your production workload. So you're not impacting them. There's no chance of that spreading or jumping out of the sandbox if it was testing for an infected machine. It's a really great tool. So when it comes to ransomware, Veeam Data Labs gives us three major benefits. First of all, it's making sure critical services such as Active Directory or SQL, take your pick, can successfully start and run after being restored into that sandbox environment. Second, the sandbox environment itself is a benefit. We can use it for performing forensics and analysis of infected machines away from production. Third is malware scanning. We can actually restore a virtual machine into that isolated network environment, and we can scan the backup file to make sure that there's actually no active malware or no malware variants running on that virtual machine inside that backup before we restore that data back into production. So expanding a bit more beyond verification of backups, it's important to ask whether is there enough resources even or capacity to recover if we needed to during a disaster recovery event. And we've seen in the Ransomware Trends Report that I referred to at the start of this presentation that a lot of organizations aren't proving that they're actually ready for recovery. And we know that they're not doing it because it is hard to do. So Veeam's response was to make it easier and to just automate it. By taking that manual element out of it and building it into our Veeam product with Veeam Data Labs, it means more organizations can get ready for ransomware recovery. And to follow on from this, it's important to get ready for recovery by actually testing your RTOs, your restore time objectives, and understand how long something actually takes to recover. Is it going to take 15 minutes or is it going to take all day? Don't make assumptions that everyone's going to know how things will work or how long things will take to recover, because during a disaster, that is actually the worst time to say, I think it works this way, or I think it's going to take this long to recover. Test, test, test. So looking at leveraging Veeam 1 with its alarms and reports, we can actually also find problems both with the backups and with our source environment before they become a bigger problem. Now, by building confidence in our ability to recover, that helps sway that decision to recover from backups instead of paying the ransom and hoping for the best. Remember, even if you pay that ransom, it's still not a guarantee that you'll be able to decrypt your data. So the next ingredient in our backup cheeseburger is that 3-2-1 golden rule of backups. But before I jump into that, I just wanted to touch on how we can determine sprawl. Now, you don't want ransomware to start from a help desk ticket or from a text from your boss saying, hey, what's this on my computer? Can you come check it out? If we can detect ransomware earlier, we improve our odds of success. So with Veeam 1, it can actually help us here by monitoring and triggering alerts that indicate an attack may be underway, which helps improve our chances of recovery. So things like the possible ransomware activity, which looks at CPU utilization, disk utilization, and network utilization across a baseline, compared to what it's doing at this moment, where we can actually say, hey, this machine's much, much, much busier than it typically would be at this time. That's a bit suspicious that the disk is being absolutely heavily utilized. Maybe there's a possible ransomware activity happening right now on this virtual machine. I'm going to flag that. Also, Veeam 1 can provide us with a suspicious incremental backup report. So what that does is it compares previous backup sizes, the last 3, against the current backup size to detect large amounts of changes. And typically with a encryption event, when that encryption is running, that's creating a lot of changes on that virtual machine disk, which we then having to back up the next backup run. So Veeam 1 can actually say, this backup is significantly larger than it was previously. That's suspicious. maybe there's a possible ransomware activity occurring on this virtual machine as we speak. Now, we can even take this a step further with Veeam One and look at something called remediation steps. Now, remediation actions. Now, if this alarm is triggered, Veeam One can then go and perform a step like, I want to disconnect this virtual machine from the network, or I want to take a snapshot of this virtual machine and immediately start a malware scan on the guest OS to look for active malware that's encrypting my information. Now, also just as important is the unprotected VM report that Veeam One offers. Now, if you've ever accidentally removed a virtual machine from a backup job, or someone has intentionally disabled the backup job or removed a virtual machine from a backup job, you'll know the pain of going to restore only not to have that restore point even available. So this Veeam One report will go and find virtual machines that should be backed up and have been backed up in the past, but were missed because someone accidentally removed it or someone has intentionally removed or disabled that backup job. It's a really good report to try and catch these sort of inside attackers or malicious attacks as they're occurring. So modern malware is known to attack the backup layer. So it is important to have something in place to combat this. And that's where this 3-2-1 golden backup rule comes in. And this backup rule recommends that we have at least 3 different copies of important data, at least 2 different types of media to store them on, and at least one of these copies being off-site. Now, with the threat of ransomware always evolving, this backup rule has also had to keep up to date and evolve alongside. And this has been handled by the extra 1 and the extra 0 on the end of that 3-2-1. Now, the extra 1 meaning we have at least 1 copy of your data that needs to be resilient, either through being air-gapped, such as maybe tape or removable media, offline, I can't reach it over the network 24/7, and it's immutable, meaning even if I can see the backups, I can't change, delete, or modify them. The extra 0 added at the very end is about automated backup verification, which helps ensure that your data is valid and is usable for recovery. Now, because remember, you can't always recover good data from a bad backup, so it is crucial to test our backups regularly. Now, among many other firsts, Veeam actually pioneered the automated backup verification, so we're quite good at finding issues that might prevent successful recovery before you do. So moving on, we've looked at the 3 ingredients for our backup burger. So now let's look at recovery, starting with our instant recovery at scale. So your data is protected and we're looking at how we can recover. With Veeam's flexibility, you have 91 ways to recover. Now, don't worry, you only need 2 or 3, but isn't it great that you have options? I mean, it's kind of like built-in future-proofing, right? The key takeaway though is the speed in which we can restore that data. In many cases, we've had customers tell us that they've reduced their restore time from days to hours to minutes. And this is very important in the case of ransomware because some organizations have chosen to simply pay the ransom because their recovery process was going to be too slow using their legacy backup system. So it might be too slow, too cumbersome, so they made that decision just to pay the ransom because in their mind, that was a better decision. Now, these organizations that choose to pay millions and millions of dollars to get back some of the data straight away, but they may then choose to actually restore the rest of their data from backups. They only care about restoring a partial subset immediately. The rest they can restore from backups. So here at Veeam, we actually want to change that equation and make the restore from backup for all data not just the right choice morally, but the right financial choice for the business as well. So for those interested, I will have a link to these 91 recovery scenarios at the end of this presentation. So you can download your own copy for safekeeping as well. So now let's talk about secure restore. So even if we have immutable backups, it doesn't mean those backups are clean. So we could have simply protected data that contains hibernating malware ready to activate at a later date after the restore. So it is absolutely crucial to ensure that whatever we're recovering is free from malware at all times. And looking back at those 1,000 IT leaders that were surveyed in the Ransomware Trends Report, we can see that 46% restored to an isolated test area or sandbox to scan before recovering back to production. Now, that's awesome. And that is super important because that sandbox helps prevent reinfection back to our already restored data that was deemed safe and clean. What is scary though is 11% who restored back to production and simply monitored for reinfection, or that 7% who simply couldn't even verify before restoring. We even had 36% who restored back to production and then they immediately scanned for malware. But you have to think, shouldn't the scanner have picked up the malware in the first place, preventing the infection happening to begin with? Oh well. So just remember, just because your backups are immutable doesn't prevent you from backing up malware in the first place and then reintroducing that threat during the recovery process. So what should we do? Veeam Secure Restore and Veeam Stage Restore are the answer to these problems. So Veeam offers this capability to have confidence in the data that you're restoring is indeed malware free. So using the power of Veeam Data Labs, we can leverage Veeam Secure Restore, which fully integrates with an antivirus scanner of your choice. Remember, Veeam is always flexible. You choose it on your terms. And during that recovery process, Veeam will leverage that antivirus scanner, that malware scanner, to hunt and find malware before it's reintroduced back to the production environment during that restore process. This helps assure that any copies of your data that you want or need to recover back into production is going to be in a good state and malware free. The other capability that I want to talk about is Veeam Stage Restore, which is a intermediate sandbox environment where Veeam will make changes to the guest OS or to the application itself prior to placing the virtual machine back into the production environment. So this could mean running a decryption tool or even deleting encrypted data prior to that VM being placed back into production. So now let's talk about the very last ingredient in our cheeseburger, and that's DR orchestration. So the worst time, the absolute worst time to realize that your backups aren't working or they've failed is during a crisis. Sadly, a crisis also seems to be the time when teams realize that there are holes in the recovery plan as well. So Veeam Disaster Recovery Orchestrator, or VDRO for short, provides the ability to create and maintain a comprehensive recovery plan and stress test that plan to give you and your leadership some confidence in your ability to recover during a ransomware attack or really any disaster. So our tools include automated recovery testing for every workload, the ability to stage workloads prior to recovery to ensure that the data is clean and everything works as expected. The net result of this is reduced risk. So we got DR for all applications with proving compliance, which can save time with automated DR documentation, no touch scheduled DR testing, and verification of all your applications. And that helps build confidence back into your backups by providing improving DR readiness, avoiding RPO and RTO violations. We want to make sure that we can meet your RPOs and restore within your RTOs, and we can guarantee that and we can test for that, and providing that one click of recovery. So Veeam Disaster Recovery Orchestrator, or VDRO, now offers support for automating recoveries from storage snapshots, backups, replicas, and even CDP replicas, or continuous data protection replicas. And with that new CDP feature that was introduced back in version 11 of VBR, Veeam is now bringing even more support for backup and disaster recovery around all aspects of your environment. So circling back to how ransomware changes how we think about recovery compared to your typical fire or flood. We need tools and processes to help determine how many systems have been infected or compromised. We need to leverage backup copies that are either air-gapped or offline or immutable so our backups can survive the ransomware attack. So you have something to recover from after the attack. And most importantly, we need to leverage capabilities to verify what we're restoring back into production is indeed clean so we don't just restart that attack. Remember, there is no one single feature that will prevent a ransomware attack 100% each and every time. Active defenses will only block so much, and we have to assume that our defenses will be breached at some point or that they already have been breached. So Veeam believes that the best offense is a solid defense against ransomware. And everything we do is to help you build a robust strategy for protecting your data. We also provide data security solutions that can help ensure that your data is safe and is available when you need it. And to help you do this, we provide a software-driven platform that allows you to protect your data with immutable storage, detect and monitor your data for threats, giving you added visibility to your existing defenses, and ensure that the data that you're restoring isn't going to reintroduce a threat. And most importantly, we provide the testing and verification required because paying a ransom should not be more reliable than simply restoring from your backups. So for those interested in downloading a copy of our Ransomware Trends Report for 2022, the link has been provided on the left-hand side. I strongly urge you, grab a copy of it. It's a really great report. It's from 1,000 IT leaders from all around the globe, including Australia and New Zealand, of small enterprise, medium and large enterprise. It's a large subset of organizations of varying sizes. And on the right-hand side, we've also added a couple other useful links which may be of interest. The first link on the right is for the Veeam hardened repository, which is an excellent resource if you want to know more about how to create the hardened repository, you want to learn a little bit more about how Veeam works with immutable backups, and just some general best practices on how to set it up. Because remember, we're software only, hardware agnostic, so you can configure this on whatever Linux distro you want, on whatever hardware you want. As long as it meets our minimum system requirements, then you can make it, you can get it to work. So if you're interested to know a little bit more about the Linux hardened repository, check out that hardened repository paper. If you're interested in working with one of our many service providers out there with, say, Veeam Cloud Connect Backup or Managed Backup Service, the second link is a great starting point. The third link is to our white paper on best practices for ransomware defense. So it's going to cover things like best practices, what you should do to prevent a ransomware, and what you should do after a ransomware to try and recover as quickly as possible. And then we also have the 91 recovery scenario poster, which is available for download from our veeam.com website. Feel free to print it out on a large A3 sheet of paper and keep it hanging around, hanging up on the wall. It's a really great reference to know what restore capabilities that you have at your fingertips with Veeam without having to memorize 91 different recovery options. So it's a really great piece of paper to print out and hang out on the wall. So finally, to close out, thank you for joining me on this ransomware webinar. Remember to follow that 3-2-1-1-0 golden rule of backups. My name's Reese Hammond, and I hope you've enjoyed this session. Cheers.